Amen. If you'd like to turn to 1 Peter chapter 2, I'm going to read two verses, verse 9 and verse 10. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, which in time past were not a people, but are now the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. You know, a few years ago, there was a few very well-known songs and Christian, music scene. One of the songs was something called You Say I Am, and the singer was Lauren Daigle, if any of you know or remember that song. Not a song I liked a lot, but some of the words when I first heard them, you know, they're good words, but I thought they were a little interesting at first. And this is how the song goes. You say I am loved when I can't feel a thing. You say I am strong when I think I am weak. And you say I am held when I'm falling short. And when I don't belong, you say I am yours. And I believe what you say of me, I believe. So the idea of the song is that whatever God says of me or of us, that's who we are. And, you know, typically I don't do a lot of introspective thinking. I don't, think a lot on life or, how I fit and where I am. I don't think about my identity, as sometimes that's used a lot. Actually, it was a funny thing. As I was thinking about that identity, what came to my mind was a little scene from Back to the Future, where George McFly was proclaiming his love for Lorraine. And, she said, "Oh, I remember you." And he says, yes, I'm George McFly. I am your density. I am your destiny. And, when I think about identity, and, I always think about our density there. So, I don't do a lot of thinking like that, which is probably the reason for that is because we as Christians, we know who we belong to. Right? We know we belong to our Heavenly Father. So we don't need to do a lot of thinking in the world about like the world does. Because we're secure in that knowledge. We have a Father that loves us, that cares deeply about us, right? And we belong to Him. We are adopted by God when we get saved. All right? One of the great benefits of salvation is the fact that we get this sense of belonging, that we are adopted into God's family. Whether we had a good family as we grew up, or whether we didn't have such a good family when we grew up, but when we get saved, we belong to the great family of God. And that's a very secure position to be in. That stabilizes your life, that keeps you going. So you don't need a lot of other, thinking like that. But so I thank God for that privilege we have and the blessing that we have, that we are children of God. We're part of that great family of God. And if you think about it, the same family as the great heroes of faith that we read from the Bible. Same family as Abraham, as Moses, as David, as Peter, Paul, Ruth, Esther, Deborah, Mary, and Martha. All of these great people of God. And we can bring it up even to more our present time, right? We think about people of God that have served God throughout the years during the Reformation, Martin Luther, John Wesley, so many others, even our church founder, right? Sister Crawford, all these people were part of the same family. That's wonderful when we think about that. That's what God does for us when we get saved. In Romans chapter 8 actually says that for many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. For we have not received the spirit of bondage to fear, but we have received the spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba, Father. So we call our God, the God who created the universe, the God who holds, the Bible says, the nations, and the nations are like a drop in the bucket, like a dust upon the earth. That's, God, the Creator, He's our Father. The Spirit itself says, bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. So we thank God for that. Now, this passage here in Peter describes 5 things of what God calls us to go along with that song title, what God says about us and who we are in the scheme of things, right? In the big picture of God being our Father. It says that we are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, and now we are a people that belong to God. And we'll tell at the end of this passage, it tells us why it's good to remember that. So let's take each one of them here briefly and just talk a little bit about this. We are a chosen generation. God calls us to salvation, and when we say yes, we are chosen. It's like this. Many of us have played in a sports team. Maybe some of you even play now on a team, right? Remember when you were in PE or whatever, and the professor or the PE teacher said, oh, okay, form teams, and, said 2 captains. So, and each one choose, right, the members on the team. When I played soccer, sometimes I was the captain and I did the choosing. But when I played here other sports, I was not the captain. I was one of the ones who were waiting to be chosen. And, as the captains go, say, okay, I want him, I want her, and so on. The person who gets picked gets to choose whether they want to be on that team, right? If they want to know, I don't want to be on that team. In a way, that's how the choosing of God is. God calls us to be on His team, but we have to say yes to that. We have to say, yes, Lord, I want to be with you, and I want to serve you forever. And that's the chosen part here, that we are a chosen people, a chosen generation. God has chosen us to serve Him. And when we said yes, we become part of His family. Like the song we sang, whosoever will may come. God is no respecter of person. The call goes out to everybody, to all the people on earth, but only the ones who say yes become part of the chosen generation. Then it goes on and says, we are a royal priesthood. Now this, I've been listening, Mirella is beating me on reading the Bible, but anyway, I've been also listening to some of the Bible on tape, or now you can go through an app and so on, but the one that's reading it for me. And when I was in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6, and God was talking to the people of Israel right before God came down on Mount Sinai and presented them with the 10 Commandments, He tells them, now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, then you shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Does it sound familiar to the passage I read in 1 Peter? Very familiar, right? No doubt Peter had that in mind when he read, or when he wrote to the people he wrote about, to the believers and that he wrote to, comparing them or connecting them to the Old Testament saints, right? The Israelites who are called to serve God. We're called to proclaim God's name. God calls them that if you obey me, that's what He told the Israelites, says if you obey these laws and these commandments, you will be my people, a kingdom of priests. Now, we don't have connection with that, and it's not that relevant in our lives. We don't go to a priest to bring a sacrifice. We don't, think that way. But what the priest was doing back then in that system, sacrificial system, they were the only ones who could come before the Lord's presence with a sacrifice. If somebody from that were not a priest wanted to bring something to the Lord, they could only bring it so far. And then the priest had to offer it and take it, in the temple or in the tabernacle before God. So what this signifies when it says that we are a royal priesthood, a kingdom of priests, it tells us to have open access before God. We have free access before. We can come before God at any time of the day or night. We can just come openly before him, and God hears us right away without anybody else in between, no man in between. Yes, we have Jesus as our mediator, but we don't need to go between any other man. We don't have to come to the pastor to tell him or to anybody else. No, we can go directly to God. Isn't that wonderful? We have free access before God. You can pray at home. You can pray at church. You can pray on the road. You can pray when you're traveling. You can pray in Korea or in Israel. God is available for us to, and he hears us whenever we come before him. Why? Because we're called to be a priest, a royal priesthood. High words, but that's what it means to us. We are chosen people, a royal priesthood to God, to bring sacrifices, our lives. We don't bring animals as sacrifices. What do we bring instead? Our lives, our hearts, our futures. We say, Lord, here am I. Here's everything. I give it to you. So that's what he says. We are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. What this means that just like Israelites were supposed to be separate from the neighboring groups of people in Deuteronomy chapter 7, and it talks a little bit about that. I don't have time to read it, but it says you need to be separate from the people around you. He even told not to get married to the people next to them because that will serve as a temptation to be led astray. So God is telling us that we as his children are to be holy, separate from the world. And actually Peter later on in this letter, in chapter 4, verse 2 through 4, tells us that we should no longer live in the flesh as we used to live, but to the will of God. And then it says that in the time past, Brother Cliff explained a little bit about some of the life he lived before, but once we become saved, we're called to no longer live that way. Not all of us lived in the same way, but all of us were guilty of something failing, coming short up before God. And when we get saved, God calls us to no longer live the same way we lived before, but to live for God now. He says, in our time past, we lived according to the will of the Gentiles when we walked in our lusts and excess of wine and revelings and banquetings and idolatries, whereas they think it's strange that you run not with them to the same excessive riot, speaking evil. In other words, your friends, our friends before, now they look at us strange. Wait, how come you don't do the same thing as you did before? And the answer is, because God changed my life. God gave me something to live for that's better, a better way of life than the way I was living before. So we're called to be a holy nation, separate and dedicated to living for God and a life that's pleasing to him. So we're a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. The next one is a peculiar people. Sometimes my wife, tells me about interesting, stories here in church. I think there was somebody who's no longer in church here, but they moved away. But sometimes when she would see how he was dressed, she would say to him, "Oh, that's an interesting tie you have on." And this person right away would say, "What do you mean by that? Is that good or is that bad? What do you mean when you say interesting? What does that really mean?" Well, when this word peculiar is used here, it doesn't mean something that's like it's the same way. Is that a little odd or strange or quirky? That's not what it's actually talking about. This word peculiar is an old word that basically what it means that we are a people, a special people belonging to God. That's what that phrase means. And actually in the Greek, it just says a people of his possession. In other words, that we belong to God. We're not alone. Sometimes we feel that it's only us or we're alone, that feeling of loneliness can creep in even when we're in a crowd of people. But remember, we're a special treasure unto God. Just like the Exodus passage I read, he says, you're a peculiar treasure, a special treasure unto me. So we belong to a Heavenly Father that thinks highly of each one of us. So high that he sent his only begotten Son to take our place. That's how much God values each one of us. So we are his special treasure, a peculiar people that belong to God. And then the last description that is used here in verse 10 says, in time past, we were not a people, but now you are the people of God. This, it's interesting in a good way. When you read the New Testament, and if you read the Old Testament not too long before then, and you can remember, that you will get all of these allusions from the Old Testament. And here, Peter, as I mentioned, the first one is from Exodus. Now, this one is from the book of Hosea. If you remember in the book of Hosea, the first chapter, Hosea marries this woman, and they have 3 children together, and eventually she's not faithful to him, and some of those children most likely were born out of adultery in her case. And the third son, God tells him, call him Lo-Ami. Lo-Ami, which means not my people. And Hosea, the prophet, and his family served as a metaphor for the children of Israel, because they were doing the same thing. They were leaving God out of their lives. And God said, tell these people that they're no longer my people, that I'm no longer their God, because they have left me. They're not serving me. So Lo-Ami, that's the name. And here Peter says, remember at some point you were not God's people, but now you are God's people. Now you belong to God. That's what he's saying through that passage. Very powerful to know that we are not alone, that God is with us. And one point Jesus says, I will never forsake you, but I will be with you. Thank God for those promises. Now he tells us all these things, that we are special, that we are loved, that God cares about us. But why? The second half of verse 9 tells us, so we can show forth the praises of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. We have a purpose. You and I have a purpose in this life. Our purpose is to show forth God's praises. Yes, we may have to look for a job to make a living, but our purpose in life is not to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer or anything else. Our purpose is to show forth God's praises, to show God's glory and God's goodness on this life, in this earth. That's why God has called us. That's why we are chosen people, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, a special treasure for God. That's why we belong to God. So we can show others God's goodness and God's love. And as we heard this morning, we show that not just by our words, but also by our actions. And we thank God that he gives us the power and the wisdom and the ability to take what we hear and apply it every day in our lives. So as we come before the Lord in prayer, remember that and to use the words of another song, that I am who you say that I am. We are the people of God. We belong to him, and it's a blessing just to imagine and to think about that, what God has done for us. We'll have a time of prayer, meditate on that, think about that, and then go out the rest of the day and next week, Lord willing, and show forth God's praises to the people around you so they also may enjoy the good life that God brings. Song number 189, let's stand for and come forward and have a time of prayer.